So Richard told me before this that he's not going to be liturgist again until we get out of Esther. He's ended up with all of the fun names through this series. But our scripture reading this morning starts with the first ending of Esther. And you can kind of see that, you can almost see just in that reading that we kind of complete one part of the story, but it's setting up the next part of it, because there are two endings really to the book of Esther. The first one sees the downfall of the villain, but then his impact still lives on after that. And that's the part that takes in the second ending. How do they deal with the things that still are going to happen because of what he has done? So there's some things to remember as we come into this part of the story today, where we build up to this first ending. We pick up where we left off last week, and we begin and we come through this first ending. And so there are some things to remember. The first is that God acts through people. Even in very small spaces, God will act. That's all he needs. All he needs is just even a small space for him to work. The second thing is that evil will always overcompensate, because they are always at the center of their own story. And in being in that center of their own story, they're going to miss so many other things that are happening, and they will always overcompensate, because they will never have enough. And the third thing is that humility is a strength, because it shows wisdom, it shows promise, and it shows hope for the future. And it's all of these things that we're going to see come into play, especially as Esther and Mordecai now have to deal with this evil plan that Haman has put forward. So let's take a look back from last week, kind of how we got to this point. How we got to this point in the story where Esther and Mordecai now need to act. Because last week we had Haman being introduced as the evil villain of the story. Actually, 2 weeks ago, we got him introduced as the evil villain of the story. And he doesn't like Mordecai through what basically amounts to a inner office feud. You know, a little, maybe more appropriate for this week, a schoolyard spat. I mean, this is the extent of like what was going on. Like Mordecai, yes, made a mistake. Yes, he should have done what he was supposed to, and bowing down to Haman at the gate when Haman was coming through. But it was probably not even a fireable offense what he'd done. Probably got a letter in his file, probably, depending on who the supervisor was, probably had some counseling or whatever to do to make sure that he didn't do that again. But it wasn't like that big of a deal. But because Haman is an evil person, because he is the center of his own story, and his ego, I think, is probably the size of the city of Susa, he takes all this way out of proportion. And add to that, he just flat out doesn't like the Jews. Haman and his people didn't like the Jewish people. And so there was always going to be conflict there between the two of them. And so that leads then to Haman, all of this going way out of context, and leads to him wanting to get this law passed that's going to kill all of the Jews so that they can take all of their stuff as plunder. Now, we aren't told specifically in there that that's what Haman's plan was, but remember the bribe that Haman was going to offer to the king to let this law pass to do this? This enormous bribe that the only person who had that kind of money back then would have been the king, and yet that's what Haman was going to offer, and probably was going to come from what he was going to take from the Jews that were going to be killed. And we're going to contrast that next week. So hold on to this thought, because it's important. With next week, what the Jews will do in response, and what they won't do with the plunder that is available to them. So hold on to that. But Haman escalates things quickly. Gets the king to go along with it, gets this law passed, and they have a date set for when this massacre is going to happen. And so this is where Esther comes in with the plan to fix this. Now, remember, Esther is smarter than most anyone else in there. And in fact, we're going to kind of touch on this a little bit later, that the women in Esther generally are smarter than all of the men except for Mordecai. Like, that just is kind of a solid blanket statement we can make. And Esther is probably the smartest of all of them, which means that she doesn't go for the big thing first. She doesn't start with wanting to make sure to get the law rescinded, but instead, the first thing she did was go to the king and ask to make a petition, uninvited. So she And the way that worked was she was taking her life into her own hands to do that uninvited, but she did it. The king granted that request. And then her request of him says, well, king, I would like for you and Haman to come join with me at a banquet tonight. The king is like, well, okay, that'll work. We can do that. Doesn't seem like that big a deal. So he asks her, well, what's your request then? He doesn't think that's that big of a deal. And she says, well, my request then is that you come again tomorrow night and we'll do the same thing. King's like, well, I'm kind of intrigued by this. That sounds like fun. He is all up for that. Haman, of course, because he loves the position this puts him in, is all about this. He thinks this is a wonderful, great idea. In this, Esther is showing humility and wisdom. She's showing an understanding of who she's dealing with and how to get all of that to play out. And through fasting and patience, because remember before this, she and her attendants had fasted for 3 days, and she had asked Mordecai to get all of the other Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days. So they were leaving space for God to be at work, and that's going to be really important just a little bit down the road. So here's how the story plays out, and y'all, this is a crazy story, how all of this happens. Because Haman manages to get himself caught in not just one, but two different traps. One that he even sets for himself in the middle of all of this. And he doesn't know about it. Like he is running, he thinks he is riding high. He's going to this banquet. It's just going to be him, the king, and the queen. He's loving this. He's that guy that's coming to the end of a marathon that is starting to slow down because he thinks he's really far ahead of everyone else around him. Starting to throw down, put his hands up in the air. He's getting ready to cross the line, not realizing that the guy in second place is going to come along right behind him. And 6 inches from the end of the race is going to beat him out. Maybe better context for this is... y'all remember this little game that happened a couple years ago between the Chiefs and the 49ers? You remember that big iconic picture that the 49ers took when they thought that they had a really comfortable lead over the Chiefs? That would have been the iconic picture from the Super Bowl if they'd won. Instead, it's become a meme of not counting your chickens before they're hatched. Because then, they go off to lose by a really large amount. Haman in this story is the 49ers. He is celebrating before he has any real right to it. And so they go to dinner that night. They have a great time. And Haman goes home that night, and he is bragging to his family. He's bragging to his friends that, hey, I was at this special dinner. It was so exclusive. There were just 3 people there, and 2 of them were royalty. This is a great thing. And he's bragging about all of this, but this is where we see Haman's, his petulance really come out. But then he says this is chapter 5, verse 13. But all this loses its meaning every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Everything loses its meaning when Mordecai doesn't bow down to me. Well, they're going to go, seriously, dude? Grow up. Like you just had this great night, but because one guy doesn't do something that you knew he wasn't going to do because he hasn't done it yet, that's going to ruin your night? Like really, man. But this is where his wife Zeresh, who again is much smarter than Haman, not that he's setting a high bar here, but is much smarter than Haman, just looks at him and goes, okay, seriously, dude, you've got all this power. You're super proud of all this power that you've got. Just do something about it. Go to the king. Just because she's smart doesn't mean that she's not also kind of a devious person. She says, go to the king. Just have him kill Mordecai for you. And while you're at it, why don't you go build a 75-foot tall pointy stick that you can impale him on? It's a little bit disturbing what she says there, but, Haman thinks this is a great idea. And so he immediately sets out about this. Doesn't matter, they have just finished dinner, which probably got out late. So he's going back into the palace grounds later at night to do all of these things. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the king can't sleep. And so he does what every good insomniac does, of course. You bring in some of your royal servants and have them read to you the royal records, right? Don't y'all do that when you can't sleep about 2 o'clock in the morning? Now, to be fair to the king, this was like the equivalent of, any of you keep a journal, write in your journal on a regular basis? I've tried, I'm awful at it. It might have something to do with the fact I don't sit down well. But some folks will do that. They'll write in their journals. If they can't sleep at night, they'll go back and flip through the pages. This was the equivalent of what the king was doing at this point. He couldn't sleep. He had someone bring in the records, and so he just kind of flipping back through there, seeing what was going on. And there's this report that gets read about an event that took place, what we would say all the way back at the end of chapter 2. Do you remember this moment in there when Esther has been crowned queen, and Mordecai, who is now working at the king's gate, overhears this little assassination plot against the king, reports it to Esther, who reports it to the king, and then those two guys get taken care of because of that. Now, do you remember this little spot in between there? Because that happens right at the end of chapter 2. We're not told anything any reward or anything that's given to Mordecai for that. But chapter 3 starts with Haman being elevated to a really high, prominent, powerful place for no reason that we're given. It just starts out saying Haman, who is being awarded this really high place, no specified reason given for it, and that's where it starts. Well, that little event before that is back. Because one of the reports that was being read was the report of that plot against the king. Now you can almost see that the king is like lying in bed trying to doze off. He's probably already about to sleep in the middle of the servant reading an account of how many bags of wool and oats and barley that they all have. Things that would even put an accountant to sleep at this point. Except they get to that report, and you can almost see the king just pop up in bed real quick, and he goes, "Wait, did we do anything for that guy? Like, he did this great thing for us. Did we do anything to reward him for this?" And you can see the servant flipping back to the pages going, "Well, I don't see anything." And now the king is disturbed by this, and he says, "Well, we've got to do something about it. I need to figure out what do we do to honor someone that we really want to honor for something good they've done." And he says, "Well, is there anyone around here that can help me figure this out?" Now, if you are the royal servant at this point, you are wanting to be out of there as fast as you can, to be out of this mess that's about to happen. He happens to look out, and remember, Haman is out in the middle of the courtyard putting together this pole that he wants to impale Mordecai on. The servant goes, "Hey, Haman's out there. You want me to go get him?" He says, "Yes." It's like, I don't know what Haman's doing out there in the middle of the night, but okay, go bring Haman in. Now, remember, Haman is not the smartest of individuals. Where most of us would put 2 and 2 together and we'd get 4, we'd go, I'm in the middle of the courtyard in the middle of night when no one else is there, the king is asking for someone to come in, and I'm the only person available. Wouldn't mean I'm going to put a whole lot of stock in being chosen, right? Haman, on the other hand, puts 2 and 2 together and gets the color purple. Because he is so super excited. It's like, the king is calling on me. King's calling on me. It's the middle of the night. King is bringing me in to ask my advice. He is so super excited. And the king says to him, "All right, Haman, I want to really honor someone. What do I do to honor them?" Remember how big Haman's ego is? This is what happens when you're the center of your own story. Haman immediately thinks this is all about him. And so he puts together, he says, "Well, King, here's what we can do." And I'm going to read this here for you. I didn't put it up on the screen because it's a little bit longer passage. But this is like the height of what a junior high kid being asked to write a creative story is going to say here at this point. Like, it's not like a super, it just seems kind of trite and just kind of strange, and at least to my ears it does. But this is what Haman wants. Remember, Haman thinks he's doing this for him. And so Haman said to the king, "Here's what should be done for the man the king really wants to honor. Have servants bring out a royal robe that the king himself has worn, and a horse on which the king himself has ridden. It should have a royal crest on its head. Then hand over the robe and the horse to another man, one of the king's officials. Have him personally robe the man whom the king really wants to honor and lead him on the horse through the city square. As he goes, have him shout, 'This is what the king does for the man he really wants to honor.'" Now this is the moment when the first trap springs on Haman, and he doesn't see it coming. Because he's made this one himself, really. Because the king, this plays to all of the eccentricities of the king. He loves this idea. He thinks it's a great idea. And he says, "That's great, let's do it." And Haman is thinking, "Yes." And then the king says, "And Haman, I want you to go and do this for Mordecai the Jew." you can almost I can almost see Haman just deflate there on the spot from all of this. Then he's got to do this. It's late at night. He doesn't go home after this. He goes out. He finds Mordecai, and I can see this happening in my head. That Haman goes out and says, Mordecai, grumble, grumble, grumble. Come over here. I need to do something for you. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Get up on this horse. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Have this robe. Grumble, grumble, grumble. And we're going to go take a trip. Grumble, grumble, grumble. He shouts out to the square, probably with as little volume as he can get away with. Here's what you do for someone the king wants to honor. Grumble, grumble, grumble. And gets through all of that, gets all of that done. And you can imagine what state of mind Haman it is at that point. He goes home after all this, sees his wife, tells his wife what's going on. And his wife, remember, is much smarter than him. And basically looks at him and says, you've lost to this guy now, don't you? There's no coming back from this. This is just the worst thing that could ever happen. And Haman's sitting there going, I know, this is just awful. Knock, knock, knock. Because there come the king's officials to escort Haman to the second dinner, or the second banquet that he's supposed to attend with just the king and the queen. It all just happens right on top of each other. And so now Haman goes out to this. He's not in a great space. And if he thought he could get away with it, probably wouldn't have gone. But he has to go out to that dinner. Now, I should note at this point, we're in chapter 6. And that right before verse 14 in the Common English Bible translation, the subtitle there says, Haman's demise. Because this is what's coming. So we're back at the palace again and we're at dinner. And remember, the king had been asking Esther, saying to her, what petition do you want? What request do you want to make of me? And she said, well, I'll tell you at the second banquet. And so he tells her, it's the second banquet now. What is it that you would like? What would you like for me to give to you? And Esther responds, this is verses 3 and 4, and she's brilliant in her response to this. She says, if it please the king, and if the king wishes, she's being very subservient here, which is exactly what she needs to do. She says, give me my life, that's my wish, and the lives of my people too. She's tying her life to the life of all the Jewish people that were affected by this order. And then she says, we've been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. Now, she doesn't stop there, though, because this next part says, there was an out to this that would have been acceptable. She says, if we simply had been sold as male and female slaves, I would have said nothing, because that would have been expected. That would have been normal. They would have seen that 100 times before, because that's the way the world worked back then. She said, if it had just been that would have been one thing. But then she ties this to the king himself. Then she says, but no enemy can compensate the king for this kind of damage. You've got this king that is intrigued by all of this, who likes Esther to begin with, and she sets up this whole thing, and he is astounded. He just doesn't know what to do with this. And King asks her, she says, who did this? Now, this is where, if we're watching an episode of Law & Order, this is the big courtroom scene where the district attorney has just asked that question. They built up this entire case. Now they bring in their star witness and they ask her, who did this? And she just points right at him. And the guy who is sitting there at the meal with him said, it's him. It's that Haman that has done this. The king is angry beyond all belief. He gets up and he storms off into the garden to go cool off a little bit before he comes to deal with this. Haman knows that he is in serious trouble, and he begins begging and pleading for his life at this point. And Haman, bless his heart, just has bad timing. Because when in the process of trying to beg for his life from the queen, from the position that he was in, the king comes back in, and it looks like he is trying to attack her. And so the king responds back to him and says, what are you doing in the middle of all this? Are you trying to molest the queen now? Really, dude, what are you doing? And then they wants to know what to do with Haman. And this is where you can tell just how popular Haman was with everybody else. Harbona, one of the eunuchs serving the king, said, sir, look, there's the stake that Haman made for Mordecai, the man who spoke up and did something good for the king. It's standing at Haman's house 75 feet high. And the chapter ends with Haman being impaled on his own stake. That is the end of Haman. Chapter 8 then starts with the king giving everything that had been given to Haman to Esther, and Esther putting Mordecai in charge of it all. And we see this huge role reversal between these two characters. And and they all live then happily ever after the end. Or is it? That's next week. We get to that second ending. This is just the first ending. You could have ended the story here. This is, in fact, the way that we end a lot of stories nowadays. We would end it here, and then we'd wait to see if it sold enough books or sold enough seats in movies before you'd have the sequel, and then the sequel would pick up with the second ending, because that's the next big, major part of the story. But here's the thing about evil. This is one of the big things that I read through Esther is the role that evil can play in the things that it can do, and that is that evil has a long tail. Its effects will continue on, even after, in this case, the main villain of the story has been taken care of, and he's had his complete downfall. The effects of that still live on. And it continues to take time to deal with this. And we see this actually play out all throughout Scripture. Whether we're talking about evil or even if we are just talking about sin, the same thing happens, because the very first time this happens is in the garden. The first time Adam and Eve eat the fruit that they weren't supposed to eat, then we see all of the effects that come after that. But we see it in the story of David and Bathsheba, after the horrific acts that David commits, that they're dealing for a couple of generations after that with what happened there. We see that when the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Now they had just sinned badly. They didn't necessarily do it out of evil purpose, but they had to wander in the desert for 40 years so they could learn how to do things right. We see it through the bad kings throughout the Old Testament that get broken up occasionally by kings that are good. So there might be a couple, 3 generations of peace and prosperity, but the bad kings that keep things going such that they are led into exile and they never make it back to the place that they had been before. We see it in the New Testament with Paul, back when he was Saul and a Pharisee and would go and would attack any of the followers of Christ. There's a reason why he was called the apostle to the Gentiles, because there were still a lot of Jews that were terrified of him, that all of this was just an act on his part. And we see it in other events that we see around us today. We see it in things like the opioid epidemic. We continue to see it with systemic racism. It's why we call it systemic. We continue to see it with the treatment of women in other parts of the world. We see it in other places around the world. Even you look at places like Haiti that have been trying for so long to overcome the things that have been done to them back in the past and continue to struggle with getting through that. We see it in places like Afghanistan and so many other places, that long tail that evil has, or even just the sin of others that it continues to carry. And it can feel big and it can feel overwhelming, but remember those things we started with, that God acts through his people. And we'll see that more in the story with Esther next week. We've seen it, in fact, already. That God acts through his people, that given even a small opportunity, he will act and he will do. Like when the king first granted Esther the opportunity to speak in front of him when she shows up at the court uninvited. It's just a little thing to allow her to speak, but it's going to carry a huge consequence as it lets her do the things that needs to be done. It's like the fact that report had been read. Of all of the reports of the kingdom that could have come in there that night, there's that one report. That the king, who probably wouldn't even have had insomnia that night, except he just had a really good time with a couple of other folks at dinner that night. And I don't know about you, but if I have a really good dinner with family or friends, it takes me a while to unwind. And yet there he is, finding that next report that needed to be read to remind him of what's going on. They can feel like random events, but there's enough of them that says God is at work. They aren't big things per se, but Esther's actions in finding humility and wisdom and taking the time and space to work all of those things out means that she had opened up those spaces for God to use. For this week, before we go into the big victory at the end of the book of Esther, ask yourself, what kind of small spaces are you creating in your life? Doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be grandiose, but what kind of small spaces are you creating for God to be at work? And through those things, we can see God do some truly amazing works and accomplish some truly amazing things. But we have to be ready for that to happen. We have to be in that right place to open those spaces up to let God work so that we aren't getting in his way. Let us go and let us be people who open those spaces up for God to use so that he can use us to do those great and amazing and wonderful things. And let us do all of this in the name of the one that God sent into the world to make all of that happen. Let us do this in Christ's name. Amen.